The Middle East was a center of global civilization long before oil was ever discovered. It is where agriculture first emerged, where irrigation transformed deserts into farmland, and where some of the world's earliest cities rose. In Mesopotamia, people developed the first writing systems, established legal codes, and organized trade networks more than 5,000 years ago. Great empires shaped the region's destiny. The Persian Empire ruled from the Mediterranean to India. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad became the intellectual capital of the world, advancing medicine, mathematics, and astronomy. And the Ottoman Empire unified vast territories, controlling trade routes and seas for centuries. Geography was central to this power. The Nile, the Tigris, and the Euphrates supported millions through fertile farmland and water transport. Markets in Baghdad, Damascus, Cairo, and Istanbul connected Asia, Africa, and Europe, making the region a hub for silk, spices, gold, and ideas. Religion also gave the Middle East global influence. It was the birthplace of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, with holy cities like Jerusalem, Mecca, and Medina shaping world history. By the early 20th century, before oil entered the picture, the Middle East was defined by its ancient civilizations, powerful empires, thriving trade, and religious significance. Its wealth came from geography, agriculture, and knowledge, not petroleum. This is the world we must understand first. Only then can we explore how different history would be if oil had never been discovered beneath these sands.
Oil changed the Middle East forever. In the early 20th century, when vast reserves were discovered, the region became the epicenter of global energy. Suddenly, small desert kingdoms turned into strategic players on the world stage. Skylines began to rise. Fortunes were made, and foreign powers rushed in to secure control. But what if this never happened? What if beneath the sands there was no oil to be found? What if the Middle East remained as it had been for centuries, defined by trade, culture, and religion, but not energy wealth? The story of the modern Middle East is inseparable from oil. It drove foreign intervention. It reshaped borders. It fueled wars and rivalries. And it gave rise to incredible riches along with deep instability. Without oil, the entire region's path would have been different. This is not just a question of money. It is about power, politics, and global influence. Would the Middle East have remained on the margins of world affairs? Or would it have developed on its own terms, free from the weight of petroleum? In this exploration, we reimagine history. We step into an alternate reality where oil never defined the Middle East, and where the fate of nations and empires unfolded along a very different path. Without oil, the Middle East would never have become the wealthy hub we know today. The glittering towers of Dubai, the palaces of Riyadh, and the mega projects of Qatar simply would not exist. Instead, Gulf nations would have remained dependent on pearls, fishing, and caravan trade, just as they had for centuries. The economic transformation that oil brought was extraordinary. Revenues from petroleum reshaped entire societies in less than 50 years. Populations grew. Cities expanded. Millions of workers migrated from abroad to build new skylines. Without oil, none of this would have been possible. Cultural influence would also look different. Today, oil-rich Gulf states project power through sports, media, and diplomacy. But without oil, the region's influence would have stayed with older centers, Cairo, Damascus, and Istanbul. These cities, with their deep histories and institutions, would likely have remained the cultural and political capitals of the Middle East. The Gulf without oil would not be a land of billionaires, luxury resorts, and futuristic skylines. It would be quieter. It would rely on the trade routes that had defined its economy for centuries. And the global image of the Middle East would be one of culture, scholarship, and trade, not oil wealth.
If the Middle East had not possessed oil, the global energy transition would have started earlier. Coal would have remained in use longer, but governments in Europe, North America and Asia would have accelerated investments in alternative energy sources. Solar power, nuclear energy, and hydrogen technology would have been developed on a larger scale beginning in the mid-20th century. The adoption of renewable technologies would have occurred decades earlier than in our timeline. For the Middle East itself, economic development would have followed a slower but steadier course. Without sudden oil revenues, Gulf states would not have constructed large-scale infrastructure projects such as new capitals, airports, and skyscrapers. Population growth would have been more gradual, and migration from South Asia into the region would have been far smaller. Instead of oil-based economies, states would have focused on traditional sectors such as agriculture, maritime trade, and local manufacturing. Governments would have relied more heavily on taxation and diversified trade rather than state-owned petroleum companies. The absence of oil income would also have reduced the likelihood of the resource curse. Corruption linked to oil revenues would not have emerged at the same scale. Social inequality would have been less severe, and regional governments would have faced greater pressure to modernize through education and innovation. In this alternate timeline, the Middle East would not have been shaped by oil wealth. It would have been defined by its geography, agriculture, trade routes, and cultural influence.
Oil turned the Middle East into a battlefield. The Gulf War in 1990 began when Iraq invaded Kuwait's oil fields. In 2003, the invasion of Iraq was also closely tied to oil interests. These conflicts shaped global politics, military strategies, and millions of lives. But without oil, would these wars have happened at all? Kuwait would have been a small desert nation with little global importance. Iraq might never have attracted such overwhelming foreign intervention. The entire balance of military involvement in the region could have been different. And if the Middle East had no oil, the world would have turned elsewhere for energy. Venezuela, Russia, and the United States all had large reserves. In this alternate reality, Caracas or Moscow, not Riyadh, could have become the centers of oil wealth. The world map of power would look very different. The Cold War too might have shifted. Instead of competing for influence in the Persian Gulf, the United States and the Soviet Union might have focused their struggles in South America. Proxy wars could have unfolded in Venezuela or Colombia, instead of Kuwait and Iraq. Oil did not just fuel machines, it fueled wars, alliances, and rivalries. Without it, the geopolitics of the 20th and 21st centuries would have been written in entirely different places. The entire course of modern history would have flowed through different channels. A world where geography determined destiny in completely different ways. Where the black gold beneath the sand never became the currency of global power. And where the Middle East might have found prosperity through different means entirely. In this alternate reality, different voices would have shaped international relations and global policy. South America could have emerged as the dominant force in global energy politics. Russia's vast reserves might have made Moscow the undisputed energy capital. The proxy conflicts that defined the late 20th century would have played out on different continents. International alliances would have formed along entirely different lines of interest. A reminder that the resources beneath our feet shape the world above them in ways we rarely consider.
If the Middle East had never produced oil, global energy development would have taken a different path. Coal would have continued as the dominant source of energy for most of the 20th century. Countries dependent on imports would have accelerated research into alternative energy earlier. Nuclear power programs in Europe, the United States, and the Soviet Union would have expanded faster. Solar energy research, which began in the mid-20th century, would likely have received greater investment from governments and private industry. Hydrogen fuel technologies, tested as early as the 1960s, might have moved into wider adoption without competition from cheap oil. In Europe, energy policy would have focused more on diversification and efficiency. Industrial nations would have relied heavily on coal, nuclear, and regional hydroelectric projects. Automobile industries may have shifted production toward alternative fuel systems by the late 20th century. For the Middle East, the absence of oil revenue would have led to slower economic growth. Urbanization would have advanced at a reduced pace. Gulf states would have remained dependent on fishing, pearl diving, and regional trade. Migration from South Asia into Gulf countries would have been limited as large-scale infrastructure projects would not have been financed. Governments would have relied on agriculture, trade routes, and religious tourism for revenue. The political systems of the region would have developed without the influence of petrodollars. This would have reduced foreign intervention, lowered internal corruption tied to energy rents, and kept societies more dependent on traditional commerce and local industries. The region's economies would have grown more slowly but with greater stability. Social structures would have remained more traditional with less rapid urban expansion. Education and local industries would have played a larger role in economic development. Governments would have focused on managing limited resources and supporting local communities. Foreign policy would have been less influenced by global energy markets. The region would have experienced fewer conflicts related to oil wealth. Traditional commerce, agriculture, and religious tourism would have remained central to the economy. The absence of oil would have shaped a different path for both energy and society in the Middle East. The world's energy transition would have started earlier, with greater investment in alternatives. Nuclear, solar, and hydrogen technologies would have developed faster. The Middle East would have remained a region defined by trade, tradition, and gradual change. Global energy systems would have been more diverse and less dependent on oil. The absence of oil would have led to a more stable and sustainable future for the region. The story of energy and people would have followed a different course. This is how the world might have developed if the Middle East had never produced oil. So, what if oil was never discovered in the Middle East? The region would likely be defined less by sudden wealth and endless wars and more by its culture, trade, and religion. The skyscrapers of Dubai would not exist, but Damascus or Baghdad might shine as thriving centers of learning and innovation. The global balance of power would look very different. Instead of Saudi Arabia or Kuwait at the heart of oil politics, Venezuela or even the United States might have held that role. Wars fought over oil in the Gulf would never have happened. And perhaps the world would have turned to solar, nuclear, and hydrogen energy much earlier. History is built on chance discoveries, on what is found and what is not. Oil changed everything in the Middle East. But imagining a world without it shows us just how fragile and how flexible history really is. Thanks for watching. If you would like to see more videos like this one, click on our channel below. Like and subscribe, and I'll catch you soon.